The brain.
I promise I told you to get chicken.
You didn't? No.
Gotta improve this memory.
When will they remember?
Yes, Mommy.
I hope he doesn't remember that.
What really sticks with kids?
Bop, bop,
How do you even know where that is?
bop.
When does memory start? Is he gonna remember that?
I didn't.
What about that?
Nice.
He better remember that.
Does gender impact brain development? How big is the brain?
Seems pretty heavy. So how much of that is brain versus like skull? Kids hit their head so often.
This is his helmet for roughly the next 8 weeks.
So he actually wasn't that upset when he got the helmet.
But he probably won't remember that phase, right? Although he did look super cute.
Please, break down the brain in a way that's easy to understand.
The brain is made up of small cells that we call neurons. These neurons basically form connections to other neurons that eventually go out to different parts of our body. The pathways start forming very, very early on. What we see is that the brain has about 100 billion neurons in it. And we see that actually in the brains of children, some studies suggest that they form as many as 1 million new connections per second. And they're making connections and breaking connections. So they're constantly changing their brain pathways and their brain function. They're constantly adapting and learning. That process starts before they're even born and certainly kicks into warp speed when they're newborn. But some of those pathways start to become more permanent and more fully formed around ages 2, 3, 4, somewhere in that ballpark.
When you get in those terrible 2s and the 3 names.
Exactly.
You're like, we
Exactly.
know what we're doing. Leave us alone. Speaking of pathways, can you talk a little bit about short and long-term memory?
I think like a useful analogy is that short-term memory or working memory is like a whiteboard. It can only fit a very finite amount of information. You're constantly having to erase it and put new information on it. But that information is very vivid. It's very easily accessible, easy to put there and easy to pull down. Long-term memory is more like a computer chip, something that gets programmed and stored deep inside. And sometimes it can be hard to pull that information up, but it's coded more permanently. That long-term memory may not have quite the degree of detail or vividness of our short-term memories, but it can be more long-lasting. Kids form both sorts of memories actually earlier than one would think. There's some studies that suggest that by 2 or 3 months, kids are starting to form some long-term memories, not long-term in the sense that they're going to last to adulthood, but long-term in the sense that if you teach them a certain task or they learn a certain task and then they're put in a position where they can reproduce that task, within about 10 days to 12 days, they will still do that task well and smoothly. But after about 2.5 weeks, they behave as though they've never learned this task before and they're learning it from scratch. Most children have their first permanent memory between the ages of 3 and 5. Now, that can be pushed earlier if it's something very powerful. Common things are like moving homes or like a loss in the family. But for the majority of us, our first memory is around age 4 or 5.
So that's when you should do the big birthday party or take your kid to Disneyland.
Well, you can. You still get great pictures if you do it earlier, but they may not remember.
We
it.
want them to remember, okay?
Right. The experiences that happen before that age still strongly shape, and there's studies that show that children who are exposed to good stress, simple stress, behave and learn better from that. But children who are exposed to what we consider kind of toxic stress, like an unhealthy situation or severe hunger, starvation, things like that. I mean, even if they don't remember that experience, it permanently affects their behavior for the long term.
First 5 years, what would be the biggest things you would see kind of happening or changing?
I think the most important are social skills and social abilities. During that time, you start to form a lot of our basic functions. Children come out able to move their arms and legs, but the ability to interact with the people around us, to understand social cues, to communicate what you need, formed so rapidly in those early years. And that's the foundation of the person that your child will become for the rest of their life.
Are you seeing any effects between how the brain develops and technology?
Back to that point I was making of, the brain making millions of connections every second. That process is dependent on stimulus. The brain needs stimulation and a certain amount of stimulation to continue forming new pathways, continue growing. I think with a lot of the technological advance that we have in the science that we're developing, we're starting to better tailor our toys and our different toolboxes as parents to help our kids develop the best they can.
What about baby helmet?
Kind of two different reasons the head can be not perfectly round. The most common one, positional Plagiocephaly. It's a fancy word, but essentially it just means that the baby probably lays a certain way frequently and leads to their head being a little bit flat on the side that they're laying on. Now, in rare cases, the head can be misshapen because some of the bones that are still developing and forming accidentally fuse together. In some cases, it can be unfortunately related to like genetic syndromes, but in some cases, it's just an anomaly. If in only one place the bones are fused together, it usually doesn't affect the brain function, but it's more likely to lead to a permanent, significant misshaping of the head. But if multiple of those bones fuse, then the brain actually can't expand inside the skull, and that's when it becomes much more dangerous. In and of itself, having a flat part or flat side of our head is not bad or dangerous, and in the majority of adults, once we grow a full head of hair, it's really not noticeable. And then beyond that, for the majority of children, as they get up and start moving around, developing head control and neck strength and spend more time on their belly and crawling, it often tends to get better. But kids who truly do have a very strong side preference, or that it's not starting to improve as they get a little bit bigger, 5, 6, 7 months, then strong consideration should be given to a helmet. The helmet is not reshaping the brain. It doesn't help or hurt brain function.
So when does the brain fully develop?
About 6 years. And then after that, we never end up having more brain cells than that point. At that point, actually, our body pretty much only loses brain cells, and we never have more connections either. Our body really actually, even as we're learning more as, older children and adults, a lot of that learning is actually done by pruning the pathways that we created as a child and making them more organized and efficient. But I guess the way I would look at it is we would think, oh, that's not the smartest age. That obviously, we continue to learn and become more and more intelligent, but that is probably the age at which we are able to learn the fastest. At that age, children can pick up new languages and new concepts so quickly. Whereas for the rest of us as adults, we learn how to learn, but it's much less natural.
And are boys and girls' brains developing differently at all, or is it pretty similar?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely significant, different in a few ways. So first and foremost, girls tend to develop a little bit earlier, especially in a lot of verbal and social cues. Many people see that daughter started talking a little bit earlier than their son up until about age 3, and that's when boys tend to catch up. In the long term, as children become older, some of those differences go away, but still, as a general principle, girls tend to show higher scores in verbal communication and recognition of social cues, facial signals, and then boys tend to have better visual spatial skills, 3D space analysis. We think that's because of differences in hormone production and also differences in some of the genetics that come on either an X or Y chromosome.
What is your advice for not losing your mind as a parent?
Yeah. Well, what I try to remind myself is that, humans have been having babies for hundreds of thousands of years in all different climates and environments. And no matter where humans have been, the majority of the babies have come out healthy and grown up well. And babies are smarter than we give them credit for. They are tougher and more resilient than we give them credit for. My name is Dr. Rishi Lall. I'm a neurosurgeon at the University of Texas Medical Branch, which is based in Galveston and the Clear Lake area of Houston. We specialize in diseases of the brain and spine and perform surgical procedures to try to cure them or fix them as much as we can. This includes a pretty broad spectrum of pathology and diseases that we treat. We treat everything from head trauma to brain tumors to arthritis and degenerative disease of the spine to scoliosis and even peripheral nerves and the whole nervous system.